So now I want to talk a bit about Nietzsche's conception of the self and the hermeneutics of suspicion. These things are kind of tied together. So Nietzsche's conception of the self. Nietzsche inherits, as we all do, a picture of the self from Descartes and the early modern philosophers and Kant, but it's also there in Christian religion, the idea of the self as a point, the idea of the self as a soul, the idea of the self as a thing. Now, this creates all sorts of problems for philosophy and for epistemology, because once you've thought of the self as a separate item that sits apart from the world, you then have the problem of trying to reconnect the self with the world, and that gives you, the epistemological problems of modern philosophy. This is a mistake from the beginning, says Nietzsche. The self isn't a kind of unit, it isn't a point, it isn't a bubble that we sort of sit in and view the world from, like a kind of cinema seat. I mean, he often doesn't use that analogy, obviously, but that's the sort of thought. No, says Nietzsche, the self is something we've invented. So part of the point of that is to separate the doer from the deed, right? Is to say, well, I performed this act. What were my motives? You think of the self as the cause and the action as the effect. And once you separate them, then you can start doing modern moral philosophy. Right? That's one of the things that's going on. Really, says Nietzsche, the self is it's something that we sort of invent, and we've invented it culturally. So think about the self as a soul. Really, what's going on is that each of us is a kind of swirling mass of needs and influences and drives. Now, this idea is there in Plato, of course. You've got the idea of the three-level self with the appetites and what Plato calls spirit, which you like your kind of resolve, your self-control, and your reason. And remember, Plato's great thing is that reason should be in charge. Well, Nietzsche doesn't really believe that we get reason and spirit or resolve or self-control for free. You don't get those just by being born human. Rather, it takes millions of years of training to produce a rational, self-controlled human being. So one of the things Nietzsche is interested in is, how does that happen? How do you go from wandering bands of baboon-like creatures to 19th century Germans who are capable of feeling guilty because they didn't say good morning to a neighbour when they passed them in the street, right? Something like that. So in a way, Nietzsche, I just talked in the earlier video about how Hegel starts the history of humanity with the first Chinese city-states. Well, Nietzsche pushes it much earlier. Nietzsche says, look, in order to have the kind of creatures who can band together and form a state, you already have to have lots of discipline. You already have to have memory, right? People need to feel obligations to each other if they're going to fight together in a group. So there's a much, much longer story about how human beings become sufficiently disciplined. And that's a story about harsh training, about training the flesh, which we'll get to later. So the point is, the self isn't something you get for free. The self is a kind of physiological function. Your mind is connected to your stomach as much as to your brain. So what you think of yourself thinking is actually your body at work, right? And one of the things that you do is self-deception. So one of the things that Nietzsche is intensely aware of in himself and in others is our capacity for self-deception. So we do this as individuals, of course. We rationalize our actions. We persuade ourselves that we had excellent reasons for doing something that actually we were motivated to do by some desire of some sort. But also we do it at a cultural level, right? So he sometimes argues this by puns. So the German expression that means I am in the right sounds a lot like the German expression that means I am revenged, right? Ich bin gerecht. Kind of sounds kind of similar. So, and this sounds a bit like Freud, right? And it should do, because this is part of where Freud comes from. The idea, remember Freud, you have the id, the ego, and the superego. Sounds a bit like Plato's threefold division of the self. So Nietzsche is in that kind of territory. If you show him somebody claiming to act for the best of possible reasons, Nietzsche is going to say, really, let's have a look at what the real reasons are. This person is almost certainly kidding themselves. They're almost certainly motivated by something grubbier and more bodily than what they're letting on. That's there in Kant too, actually. I mean, we think of Kant as this, as being all about rectitude, upstanding, following the moral law, but that's the model, right? Kant says, before he sets that model up in the groundwork, Kant says, well, whenever we look at people's real motives, we always find what he calls the dear self. And Kant says it's entirely possible that there never was a purely moral act in the entire history of the world. Nevertheless, I, Kant, am going to tell you what morality means. So the idea that the dear self is driving even what seem to be our morally motivated actions is already there in Kant. Nietzsche plays this up big time. So Nietzsche has a model of the self in which the self is something that you achieve, right? So you are a relatively well-behaved, house-trained, domesticated, reliable human being, not because you have a soul, but because you are the outcome of thousands, hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions of years of training. Your decency, your ability to hold yourself together, your ability to say, yeah, I'll be there tomorrow, and show up, is all to do with a long story in which people got beaten for failing to keep their promises, in which people's bodies were systematically disciplined. Now, humanity is so thoroughly domesticated that nobody needs actually to raise a stick to us. We can be disciplined just by feeling someone's disapproval. But that's because we're so thoroughly house-trained, right? Sometimes Nietzsche talks about the self as a community, so that there's lots of different influences, lots of different spirits, lots of different drives competing with each other to, as it were, grab the steering wheel of your life. That's, and if you're able to turn this community that jointly constitutes yourself into some kind of coherent political unit, well, congratulations, that's good for you. It's something you have to achieve. It's not something you get for free.